starting a new series tonight called The Bloody Bible. And it's one of those things, if you just stick to the New Testament Bible, let me start that over. The Bible, there's a lot of people in here who might not be familiar with the Bible. It can be kind of daunting if you have one of these in your hand and you open it up and it's like, oh, this doesn't look very thick, and you open it up and you realize that they put it in like 3-point font and there's 2 columns per page, and you're like, holy cow, there's a lot of stuff in there. And then you start reading it, and there's words that you can't pronounce. There's not like chapter titles so much. There's book titles, and there's different authors, and they call God different things. And you're like, you get into it, and you're like, this is just weird. I don't understand this. And so I understand that. But one of the things you got to know about the Bible is that it's divided up into 2 what they call testaments. There's the Old Testament, and there's the New Testament. The New Testament is what you hear about most of the time. It's the part where Jesus takes center stage. It's when God sends His Son to us. And the New Testament has Jesus' birth, His life, His death, His burial, and His resurrection. And then it gets into how the church begins, where Mount Zion is a church, but you get into the New Testament where it's the church, the universal, worldwide church that goes all the way back to 33 AD when the church starts all the way up till now. It's got all that history in there. But then there's this other part of the Bible that you might not get into very much called the Old Testament. It's the first part of the Bible. It's actually like 2/3 of the Bible is the Old Testament. And it's got some weird stuff in there. And if you dig into it, if you read it, it almost gives you the impression that there's a different God in the first part of the Bible than there is in the second part of the Bible. Because in the second part of the Bible, in the New Testament, it talks about God's love. He sends His Son to die for us. He loves us so much. But in the first part of the Bible, in the Old Testament, you hear a lot about God's wrath, His anger. And if you read these stories, they can be pretty bloody. And I've talked before about Knox and Helen's Children's Bible. And we read them a Bible story every night, but these Bible stories that are in there, they're not the full story. Because there's some parts in there that they leave out. There's some parts of the Bible that are not safe for Knox's ears or Helen's ears. Like David and Goliath. It's a great story, but usually in their Bible, the story ends with David defeating Goliath. It doesn't say that after he defeats Goliath, David takes his sword and chops his head off. It leaves that part out for some reason. And when it talks about Daniel and the lion's den, the story usually stops when Daniel gets rescued. It doesn't talk about how the king was so mad at his advisors that he sentenced the advisors to the lion's den. And it definitely doesn't say that the lions had them eaten before they touched the ground. That's in the Bible. That's pretty bloody. The Old Testament has all kinds of stories about wrath and anger and revenge and war. It's pretty bloody in there. And so if somebody's reading that part of the Bible and they're reading the New Testament part of the Bible, they're going to think, well, this is 2 different gods. There's 2 different gods. I can see how you might love to serve this New Testament God. He's very loving and kind, and it just seems like a really, really good guy. You know, somebody you want to be a buddy with. But this Old Testament God, he's mean. He's just vengeful. He's angry. Why would anybody want to serve that God? You might even think, well, maybe it's the same God, but maybe He changed. Maybe He changed His mind somewhere in between Malachi and Matthew. Maybe He just changed His mind. He decided, you know what, I've had enough of being negative. I'm going to have a sunny disposition from now on. Maybe He watched some Dr. Phil episodes and just decided He's going to become a happy God or something like that. And maybe you think He changed His mind, but the thing about that is you think, well, what if He changes His mind again? What if He goes back to Old Testament God? What are we going to do then? And so if you don't understand these Old Testament stories, you're going to have questions like that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to get into these stories, these bloody stories from Scripture, and learn a little bit more about this God. Because the thing about God is He's one God over the entire Bible. Old Testament God, New Testament God, same God. There is no change. There is no change. The Bible says there is no shifting shadow. There's no turning with Him. God doesn't change. It's a God. When it says God is this, it says a truth about God in one testament. It's true in the other testament. So when it says in the New Testament that God is love, that means that God always has been love. He is love, and He always will be love. But when it says also that God is a jealous God, that means that God was jealous. He has always been jealous. He is jealous, and He will always be jealous. And so we have to understand the God that we read in the Old Testament Even the God that talks about, that lays out some of those words that we saw on the screen, even that God is the same God that we serve now. And so we're going to get into these stories. Next week we'll talk about a time when God said, Israelites, you're going to wipe off entire people groups. You're going to wipe them out. The third week we'll talk about a time when God said, I'm going to send an angel and he's going to kill the firstborn son of every Egyptian family. Then we're going to talk in the fourth week about God saying, I'm sending my son and he's going to die a violent death for you. But tonight we're going to get into a story about sacrifice. I keep thinking what we're doing this thing. We're going to talk about a story about sacrifice. And you might have heard us talk about sacrifice before. And if you've gotten into the Old Testament at all, sacrifice is kind of it's a popular topic that you come across. And let me tell you why. In the Old Testament, people sinned just like we did. Now our sin now, just like their sin, puts us in debt to God. Our sin puts us in debt to Him. We owe Him something. And the New Testament, Romans 6:23 says that the wages of sin is death. That if you sin, you deserve to be dead, eternally separated from God. And it was the same debt in the New Testament as there was in the Old Testament, but God didn't want His people dying, His creation, these people that He created by hand. He didn't want them dying, and so He provided this thing called a sacrificial system. And so instead of people dying for their sin, they would come every year to the temple. A Jewish family would come to the temple every year and sacrifice an animal. And that animal would pay for the sins of the entire family. And so it's kind of a violent ritual all throughout the Old Testament. So it gets pretty nasty, pretty bloody in the Old Testament when it talks about that. But tonight we're going to talk about a story that happened before even those kind of sacrifices. We're going to talk about a time when God went to a man and said, listen, I know that you have this son, I know you have this only son, and that you love him. I'm going to need you to sacrifice him to me. And when you hear this story, I hope that you're going to hear it with new ears tonight. Maybe you've heard it before. I hope you're going to hear it with new ears tonight. If you've never heard it before, I'm glad that you're going to hear it tonight because I think it's vitally important. God demanded a sacrifice from this person, and God still demands sacrifices today. God asks for us to sacrifice things for Him today. He might not. I don't think He's going to ask you to give up a child later on in life. But He does ask us to make sacrifices. He asks us to maybe sacrifice friendships that are pulling us away from Him. He might ask us to sacrifice, He asks you to sacrifice Wednesdays and Sundays to come to church. Maybe when you get older and you're growing in your faith, He might ask you to sacrifice your comfort and go on the mission field or something like that. God asks us to sacrifice for Him all the time. Now you might be thinking, well, if God loves me and wants me to be happy, why is He asking me to sacrifice? If baseball makes me happy, why would He ask me to sacrifice that? If my friends make me happy, why would He ask me to sacrifice that? If living in America makes me happy, why would He ask me to sacrifice that? And usually what happens is when He asks us to sacrifice something, is because it's taken His place in our lives. God always wants to be number one. He wants to be first and foremost in our lives. And when something else takes that place in our lives, He wants to replace it. So He asks us to sacrifice those things. Now maybe you've never been asked to sacrifice. You don't know if you've been asked to sacrifice something before. If you're a follower of Christ, you will at some point. There is no denying that. Maybe you have been asked to sacrifice it, and maybe you thought, you know what, I'm going to do this because I know that God will bless me if I do this. I know that God's going to look down on me and He's going to smile and say, good boy, good girl, here's all this other stuff because you sacrificed for me. Sometimes it might turn out that way. You might say, you know what, I'm going to sacrifice this week of practice so I can go to summer camp with the church. And you have a great time, everything goes well, you grow closer in your faith, and it's just an incredible week. But maybe sometimes you make that sacrifice and it doesn't turn out exactly like that. You miss practice and you get back and you've been on this incredible trip and feel like you've been growing closer to God, but then you come back and like you were gone so much at your starting spot. Or maybe you said, you know what, God, I know you want me to sacrifice these friends because they're taking me away from you. You want me to cut them out of my life, at least for a time. And so I'm going to do that. And you think, I'm going to be fulfilled. I'm going to be happy. This is going to be great. And instead of feeling that way, you feel lonely. You feel like you're missing out on stuff. Why does God let you do that? Why does God let that happen to us? Why does he ask us to give so much to him? That's what we're going to get into tonight. Why does God ask us for so much? We're going to look at that in the story of Abraham and Isaac. And so we're going to be in Genesis chapter 22. If you've got your Bibles, you can go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 22. Just so you can catch up on where we're at in this story. Abraham and Sarah were an older couple that could not have kids. They were barren. They weren't allowed to have kids just from health issues. They couldn't have kids. And in that culture, that was kind of frowned upon. They were not looked well upon by their community. It was a burden that they carried. But then God came to them and says, listen, Abraham, I know that you've never had kids. I just want you to know, even though you're old, you're going to have kids. Not only are you going to have some kids, you're going to have lots of kids, and your descendants are going to number more than the stars in the sky. I'm going to make a great nation out of you. And so God comes into Abraham and says, like, you know what, you don't have kids right now, but I'm going to do something pretty cool through you. And so Abraham and Sarah, at first they didn't believe him, but then they believed him. And lo and behold, they had a son. His name was Isaac. Let's start Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Stop right there for a second. Normally, we don't identify child sacrifice with the Bible. That's not something, maybe you've heard about that in ancient religions, that child sacrifice was like a thing back then. But we don't ever think about that with the Bible. But here's God coming to Abraham and saying, listen, Abraham, I know I promised you that you're going to have this great nation, and I gave you Isaac, and he's this blessing to you. I know you love him very much. He's your only child. I know you love him. I'm going to need him back. I'm going to need you to go ahead and kill him. So you're going to bundle everything up. You're going to go up to this mountain. You're going to build an altar, and it's going to be like this ritual killing. You're going to kill him and give him back to me. What? Excuse me? God, you said before that he was going to be a blessing. That through him, I was going to have many nations, and this is not right. What's going on here? I mean, imagine taking that news if you're Abraham. I mean, what would go through your head? Sometimes we hold these Bible characters up on a pedestal, but Abraham was a human just like you and me. And God asked this massive thing of him. You know there was doubt. You know there was fear. You know that he had a tough time digesting what he just heard. Maybe it just ran back through his head all these firsts that he had experienced with Isaac. Isaac's first steps, Isaac's first words, Isaac's first camel ride or donkey ride or whatever they rode back then. Whatever it was, he ran through all this stuff. He's like, really, God? You're going to take him away from me? Not only is he this son that you promised me, but also I love him. Why would you do this to me? Let's see what he did next. Verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place which God had told him. I imagine it kind of going like this. After God tells him this is going to happen, Abraham probably couldn't sleep that night. He probably went back and forth between praying and pleading with God, don't let this happen to me. And then going back to all those memories he'd had of Isaac. Just back and forth, back and forth. Couldn't sleep, gets up early in the morning, starts getting everything ready for the trip. Goes and chops the wood. Sarah comes out, he's like, Abraham, why are you up so early? What's going on? He's like, I'm taking Isaac on a camping trip. And she's like, well, that's fantastic, but you don't have to leave for a while. Why don't you come back to bed? And he's like, no, I can't. I'm too busy. She's like, what are you going to do while you're on this camping trip? And he's like, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what happens. And so Abraham chops the wood, and then he saddles everybody up, and they go. They go. I think that's incredible that Abraham somehow, in all those conversations with God that night, staying up late, praying, asking God to let this pass, remembering all these things with Isaac, Abraham somehow got from doubting and fear to to trust. He went from doubting and fear and maybe anger, maybe trying to figure out ways out of it, saying, I don't have to sacrifice this, I can do this. Maybe he was making deals. God, I'm not going to give you Isaac, but I'll give you a couple servants of mine. I don't know how you want to work this out, God, but just don't take Isaac from me. He went from there, from resisting the sacrifice, resisting what God asked him to do, to somehow he's like, all right, let's go. Let's do it. When God asks you to sacrifice something that's important, that's usually going to be our response is, God, that's too far. It's too far. You know, I was okay, God, when you asked me to sacrifice Wednesday nights. There really wasn't anything going on there anyway. I was okay when you asked me to sacrifice Sunday mornings. I'm a little tired when I go to church, but I can get a good nap in the pew because it's got padded seats. I was okay when you asked me to sacrifice those things, but not this, God. It's too much. It's too much. I can't do this. That's our normal response. In my experience, when God has asked me to sacrifice something, it's because that thing has taken God's place in my life. That's usually when I see God ask me to sacrifice something. And when I sense that that's what God's asked me to do, I do what Abraham did. I try to make deals. I barter. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to change. I'm going to do it right from now on. And it's all just a smokescreen. I'm trying to hold on to that thing as long as I can. It makes me happy because I like it. God's asking me to sacrifice it. And this thing is, this kind of doubt, this kind of fear, or this kind of discomfort, it's what Jesus was doing in the garden. Right before Jesus' crucifixion, he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he says, Father, if it's possible, just can we get out of this? If there's any other way, God, if there's any other way, I'll do this. He says, but not my will, but your will. Jesus doubted in that moment. He looked for a way out. He wanted there to be a way out. But he says, ultimately, it's not my will. It's your will. So if you need me to sacrifice this, I will. So how did Abraham get from that point to doubt and deal making to, okay, Lord, let's go? Look at verse 6, 7, and 8. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together, and Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father. He said, here I am, my son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for burnt offering, my son. And so they went both of them together. A lot of times when we've heard the story, we might have in our head that Isaac was a little kid. He wasn't all that little. He wasn't a child, because it says that Abraham gave the wood to him. He's like, you're going to have to carry this wood up a mountain. So Isaac had to be somewhat strong to carry wood up a mountain. So we're looking like teenager age. And as they're walking up this mountain, Isaac starts doing some sacrificial math. He starts looking at all the resources they have. He's grown up with Abraham. He knows what it takes to do a sacrifice. He knows everything they need. And so he's looking, he's like, all right, wood, yeah, fire. What are we missing? Knife. Oh, we got the knife. Dad, I think we're missing something important here. You see, we got the wood, we got the fire, we got the knife. We don't have the lamb, we don't have the animal to sacrifice. And here's the key. Abraham says, God will provide. God will provide. Abraham, during that night, when I don't think he could sleep very well, Abraham thought back over his entire life. Abraham thought back to the times when he and God had talked about some things that God wanted him to sacrifice. Abraham had to deal a lot with God. First, God said, hey, I'm going to make you a great nation. And Abraham's like, shoot, sign me up. Let's do this. He didn't realize what following God would cost. The first thing that God said is, Abraham, I need you to leave your homeland. This place that you've grown up, you got to leave. So Abraham leaves, and when they left at that time in that culture, they took the entire extended family with them. So this big caravan of Abraham took off. And then they got to a stopping point, and God says, all right, Abraham, you got to leave your extended family. I just want your immediate family. You guys are the ones that are going to go on from here. And so Abraham, all right, I'll leave my family behind. The immediate family then included like his brother and his brother's kids. They get to another part, and God says, all right, Abraham, we've got this massive land we have to divide up. So you and your nephew Lot, you guys are going to have to divide this up. And Abraham took the worst land, gave the best land to his son Lot, the sacrifice that God asked him to make. There's another time when Abraham was offered a king's reward, like a king's ransom. And God's like, no, you're not going to do that. And Abraham's like, come on, look at all that gold. And he's like, no, you're not going to do that. So Abraham sacrificed that. Every single time that God asked Abraham to sacrifice for him, God came around with something so much better. Came around with something so much better, this provision. Abraham had to leave his family. God provided him a new family. Abraham had to leave his homeland. God provided him with a new homeland. He gave away the best land. God made his land flourish. He gave up this king's reward. He made Abraham wise so that he became wealthy. All these things, God said, you're going to sacrifice this so that you can trust me. And Abraham said, okay, I'll trust you. And God came through every single time. And so as Abraham prayed that night before about this, he had to remember all those things. You know what, God, I don't know what you're doing, but I know that you're going to provide. So we're going to go. So they started taking off up the mountain. Abraham's getting closer and closer, hoping that any moment God's going to come in and stop everything. Let's get to the climax of the story, verse 9 through 14. When they came to the place in which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything for him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and there was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. Abraham went and took the ram, offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide, as it is to this day. On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. We're running out of time, so let me just summarize what's happened there, and we'll finish it up. Abraham was going to follow through. He bound his son. It's amazing as an aside that Isaac, his strong son, would allow his father to tie him up on this altar. It says something about Abraham's fatherhood and what he's been teaching Isaac. Abraham goes to kill his son, to sacrifice his son. God steps in and says, because you have not withheld your son that you love, I'm going to let you be a part of this blessing. Because you've given everything to me, because you trust me so much, because you have such love that you're going to give me everything, I'm going to let you be a part of this blessing. What an incredible privilege. What an incredible privilege. So God provided a ram and said to sacrifice. Now our first story of this series doesn't involve blood. It comes pretty close. It's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to think that we serve a God who was almost okay with human sacrifice. That kind of sits uncomfortably a little bit. But what I want you to focus on is that God's going to ask you for things that are big. God's going to ask you for things that are big. And you have to be willing to give those to him if you want him to use you. If you want him to bless you, if you want him to work through you, you've got to be willing to give up those big things. This God who asked Abraham to sacrifice his son is still the same God that we worship today. He still asks us to sacrifice things for him all the time. And you might be like, why does he do that? Why doesn't he want me to be happy? Why does he do that? Why can't he just let me be happy and enjoy life? Isn't that what he's supposed to do? He's supposed to let me be happy? Let me give you a few reasons that he does that. First of all, this is what we're going to close with. First, there's nothing that we have is ours in the first place. Nothing we have is ours in the first place. Psalm 24, verse 1. Everything belongs to the Lord. Let me read this version. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. This is the Bible saying everything we have is God's in the first place. All the shirts we wear, all the cars that we drive, all the mountains that we can hike, and all the air that we breathe, which we sang about, it's all his anyway. It's all his. And the thing about when it's his, that means that he can take it if he wants it. He can take it if he wants it. You can either give up. If he's asking you for something, you can either give it up or he can just take it from you. Because he's God. Because he can do that. Because he is beyond the most powerful thing that we've ever experienced. Because he's bigger than the biggest thing that we've ever experienced. Because he created everything. And because everything that has ever been and will ever be belongs to him, he has the power to do that. And the sooner we can get to that understanding, the sooner we can get to that knowledge, the sooner we'll be able to understand that, you know what, I'm willing to give up everything for him. That's the first thing. Second, God wants to be the first priority in your life. The very first commandment that God gave is that we should have no other gods before him. That's the very first command that he gave with the Ten Commandments. And so he's to sit on the throne of our lives. And when he's not there, he's going to look to replace whatever is there. He's going to look to replace whatever is there. The third thing is that God does want us to be happy. But we have a really distorted view of what happiness is. Happiness is about how we feel at that moment, the way a certain thing makes us feel. But that thing that makes us happy doesn't last. And if you think about it, the tricycle you got for your third birthday, you were so happy when you got that. But you're not happy about it anymore because you got a bigger bike or because you have a car. The tricycle doesn't make you happy anymore. There's a time when you went to the store, you really wanted a shirt, and your mom or dad bought you that shirt, and you were so happy about it. Now the shirt has holes in it, and you've moved on to other shirts. There's a boyfriend or girlfriend that you went on a date with, and you were so happy. You guys had a fantastic relationship. You were so happy, but then things soured. And you broke up. You're not happy about them anymore. God knows that what makes us happy doesn't last. What he promises us is more than happiness. He promises us fulfillment and joy and satisfaction. 100% of the time, everything that is not God will fail us, without a doubt. God never fails. God never fails. And so he wants to be on the throne of our lives because he knows that anything else is going to make us miserable. He's going to ask us to sacrifice those things so that he can be number one in our lives. So what is it that God's asking you to sacrifice today? I don't know what it is. That's something you're going to have a conversation with God about. What's he asking you to sacrifice? For different people, it might be something small. He might just be asking you to take some time during the day to read the Bible. That's a sacrifice, but it's a small sacrifice that you can be willing to do. For some of you, he's asking you to give up something big. He might be asking you to give up a relationship. He might be asking you to give up an extracurricular activity. He might be asking you to give up some kind of addiction or some kind of weekend event that you really want to go to that's going to do wonders for your reputation, your popularity, whatever that is. What's he asking you to give up? I hope that when you have those conversations with God, you remember what Abraham did, how Abraham responded. And remember that God always provides. He always provides. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this day. We thank you for those stories in the Bible that make us uncomfortable, those stories in the Bible that are difficult for us to hear about and read about. God, I pray, God, that as we dig into these stories, that we see so clearly your love flowing through these things. God, that when you ask us to sacrifice something, it is not just to make you feel God good, but God, you ask us to sacrifice those things because you know that you are the only thing that can satisfy us. You love us so much that you don't want us to be hurt by something else that's going to let us down. God, for these students in here that are dealing with things that they need to sacrifice, they know that you want them to give them up. God, I pray that you give them the strength to give those things up. They depend on you. God, that they're able to walk away from whatever that is and point themselves towards you and find fulfillment and satisfaction completely in you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.